Welcome to Must Read Classics, a series of interviews focused on books in homiletics that by virtue of their ongoing impact have attained the level of classics. I'm Alyce, McKenzie, and these interviews are sponsored by the Perkins Center for Preaching Excellence at SMU. Today, our focus is on a book published in 1989 entitled Preaching and the Literary Forms of the Bible. And the author is Thomas Long, and he is kind enough to give us some time this morning to talk about his book. So thank you so much for being here with us today to talk about this.
My pleasure.
Book with enduring importance. Dr. Long is the Bandy Professor of Homiletics Emeritus at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. He's a distinguished author, teacher, preacher. He was my own doctoral advisor, and if we have time, I'll speak in glowing terms of the impact of this book on my own work on proverbs. But for now, I want to focus on Dr. Long and on his book, Preaching in the Literary Forms of the Bible. And I always wonder when I encounter a book on a kind of specific topic like this, what was it that led you to this topic?
Yes.
Yeah, what was it?
Well, two things really. First of all, I had written my own dissertation a decade before this book on structuralism, which was a sort of an approach to literary criticism popular in Europe. And I wrote the dissertation, but through writing the dissertation, I kind of lost my enthusiasm for structuralism. But I gained an appreciation for the literature it introduced me to, which was on literary and rhetorical approaches to texts. That was becoming popular in biblical studies as well, as we were moving away from strictly historical criticism to an appreciation of the artistic qualities of biblical texts. The other thing that stimulated me to write this book was we had just been through a time in American homiletics when there was a tremendous focus on narrative preaching. Everybody was doing story analysis and story preaching, and I was too. But it occurred to me that humanity does not live by stories alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God, and that there were other forms in the scripture than simply straightforward narratives. There were proverbs and psalms and parables, some of which are narratives and some of which are not. So I decided to say, what can we do as preachers to take advantage of the artistic, literary, rhetorical power of biblical texts? So that the sermon becomes the second generation of that rhetorical power in homiletical form.
Right. So moving beyond just historical criticism, which is still helpful, to view texts not as containers of theological ideas, but more as kind of dialogue partners waiting for interaction with us.
Yeah, and it was part and parcel of something that was happening in homiletics anyway. We were moving away from the notion of the sermon as a message to the sermon as an experiential event. Something happens in our preaching. And if that's the case, then we need to stop taking biblical texts and boiling them down to the stain in the teacup of the message and thinking about the ways that they create experiences. When almost all of the Bible was written not to be read off the page, but to be spoken out loud, to be heard. And their fingerprints all over the scripture of the intentionality of the writers to use the right words and the right structures in order to cause things to happen. So I wanted to develop a method that preachers could use in their studies to take advantage of that. And that's what this book is about.
I remember one time I had a student who, whatever text was assigned, it was always the same sermon. It was a good, well thought out idea, but it seems like what you're after is a text to sermon method that doesn't wash out the power, the literary power, the rhetorical power of
A psalm is acting on our imagination in ways that are different from a healing story. Both of them are powerful, but they're quite quite different in what they're trying to do. So what we needed, at least I thought what we needed as preachers, was a way to look at texts that required us, enabled us to take advantage of the rhetorical power that's there.
Mm-hmm. It's like a symphony with many instruments, and if you always go for one idea, the eternal significance that you find in the text, it sort of reduces it to one instrument.
That's right. I've just finished a new book on the parables of Jesus, and I've got a chapter in Preaching the Literary Forms on parables, but this turns the microscope power up and looks at that genre even more closely. And one of the things that I found is that, for example, Luke and Matthew are quite different rhetorically in their use of parables. Mm. Luke has 4 parables that have soliloquies in them, where a character like the prodigal son will say, "What should I do? What am I going to do?" And of course, that invites the hearer of that parable to think, what would I do? Or what do I think that character ought to do to get out of this? It's very, very existentially involving. Mm-hmm. Matthew's parables are utterly opposite. It'll be, there are these 10 bridesmaids, 5 of them are wise and 5 of them are fools. Any questions? It's no characters change in Matthew's parables. We don't get existentially involved in them. We watch foolishness and wisdom play out.
Right, right. The other thing that I think of as you talk is the fact that there's so many different learning styles that people have. Exactly. And they're also, we've been taught to exegete our congregation and its needs and challenges. So to only choose one sermonic approach that is so heady and conceptual would seem to diminish the impact in general on the congregation.
That's very thoughtful, Alyce. And I think to appreciate the diversity of rhetorical and literary forms in the scripture, pushes us as preachers to be more diverse in the way that we present sermons, so that the sermon that one week appeals to the mechanical engineer but leaves the literary critic or the English major cold, next week we're coming at them with a different voice, and the literary critic or the English major says, "Now that's real preaching." When you right,
exactly. So I was intrigued also by the parallel that you drew that really clicked for me in rereading the book, and that is that there's the communication has a form in everyday life.
That's right.
You talk a lot about expectations that we bring to biblical texts and that we bring to maybe not thinking about them, to like weather reports and fairy tales. I mean, so
there are all kinds of clues of how to listen and how to receive. If I greet you on the street and, "Alyce, good to see you. How are you?" I don't expect you to pull an X-ray out of your purse and give me a medical report. We're engaged in a different genre now.
Right. And sometimes I tend to ignore weather reports, and that's a bad idea, right? Weather report is an urgent, especially if there's bad weather coming. I don't interpret that as a once upon a time. No, it's tonight, and you better get into your storm shelter, right? So I thought that was really helpful to say, we know how to come with expectations in different forms in everyday life. Why do we cast that aside with regard to Scripture?
Right, and when we impose on Scripture a single lens, like this is the Bible, rather than this is a poem or this is a proverb, we at least miss some things and often misinterpret things. I think about the Old Testament scholar John Barton, who says, when the Scripture comes at us with an apocalyptic language and says something like, the moon will drip blood and the stars will fall from the sky, we know that the next verse is not going to be, Thursday will be partly cloudy followed by rain. Right. We're in a different world with the apocalypse.
Exactly. But you're not saying that the sermon has to exactly mirror the form of the literary text, right?
No, that would be difficult, if not impossible. If we're preaching on a psalm, we don't create a new psalm.
Right.
But what we do is we say, what that psalm is doing is generating awe or joy. And how can the sermon participate in that generation in a new genre, the sermon genre? So if I preach on make a joyful noise to the Lord and don't generate some joy in the sermon, I have missed some of the power of that psalm.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the clarity that you walk through the various steps, especially the first three that where you name the genre, and then you
Right.
talk about what its function is, and then the literary devices. So the clarity of that, like, okay, here's the genre, and here is what it would like to do, and here are the specifics within it that help it to do that. So that navigating that space is I think very helpful.
Yeah, it forces me as a preacher anyway, if I follow the steps of my own method, to say, what am I dealing with here? Am I dealing with a proverb? Am I dealing with a miracle story? What exactly am I dealing with here? And then what characteristics does it share with other species, other specimens of that genre? And then what are the particular ones that are devices that are used in this text? It really focuses my attention on that. And I find that if I do that, by the time I get around to the other steps of how can I do that in my own sermon, I'm full of ideas. It's a very generative process, I think.
Right. And I should say how much I appreciate this book, because I was looking at it as I reread it, and it has my name and it has the year. We won't go into how many years ago this was. It was a few. And DS 96. So I believe that was a course I took with you and Patrick Miller on Old Testament genres for Christian preaching.
I think that's
yeah. So
wasn't that where you first wrote your Proverbs material?
Yes.
Was for
So your book has a place dear to my heart, because it did inspire, and you inspired me to focus on Proverbs and then wisdom.
Yeah, well, you certainly took it deeper and farther than I did, and I'm grateful for what you've done with that.
Well, thank you. So in thinking about this then, in the current homiletical team, what would you say, or would you hope to be the sort of the pointed benefit of the book for a next generation?
I fear that both in the academic field of homiletics and in the practice of ministry, that the sheer joy of biblical exegesis has somewhat been diminished. Mm-hmm. The being a pastor is a busy experience, vocation under any circumstances, but especially now the challenges are great, and people don't have the time to put in on sermons that they may once have had. I get that, but the sheer pleasure of having something generate out of a text that is compelling, that makes you want to get in the pulpit and speak. I hope that this book was stimulated by that and would keep stimulating that impulse in the field and in the practice of ministry.
Mm-hmm. So that it wouldn't be like, well, I have to preach this Sunday, but I get to preach this Sunday.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this book, Preaching and the Literary Forms of the Bible, Thomas G. Long. And I recommend that you get it off your shelf and reread it if you have it. And if you don't have it, immediately order it online, whatever vendor you choose. So thank you so much, Tom, for being with us today.
It was a joy. Yeah.